I got 9 o'clock, so take it away, Jose.
Take it away with time traveling because it's 10 o'clock. All right, there's that. Okay, so I am me. Hopefully you know who I am. If you don't, I work for Stephen Gould. I've been here about 4 or 5 years. We do all sorts of things, mostly packaging, but also others. And so today I wanted to kind of talk about a little problem we run into and how we ended up solving it, which I think turned out pretty neat. And it's something that I think most people can relate to and are going to run into at some point. And the problem is, of course, well, having users. Yeah, that's right. So as you can see here in these beautiful screenshots I posted, we have a couple of orders in our system that are going to be extremely nice for our bottom line. We have, I think that's $126 million order and a $2 million PO. And like this one, we had, I don't know, a couple of handfuls once every couple of months. And what happens is our users really, really love that price per and cost per field. I don't know why. It is my most hated field in all of Epicor, I think. But they love that field, yet they forget to use it. So what happens is they're entering this order here they're buying 78,000 units of, I don't know what the heck a tray 26 by 5 is. And the price on this is actually per 1,000. So for every 1,000 of these units, we're paying $1,600. But they forgot to select the price per on this. And so what happens is that order turned out, which was supposed to be a couple $1,000, a few $1,000s, turned out to be $126 million. And we have told our users that, you know, every time you enter an order in the system or a PO, you need to double check your work, make sure that your totals work, but they don't. And so what happens is this order goes in, it immediately hits the bookings table. I don't know if you're familiar with bookings, but we rely on bookings pretty heavily to determine what our burn through rate is and our backlog. And so what happens is our bookings shoots through the roof for that week. The salesman who gets commission on these orders gets really excited about the fact they're going to get a very big back check. And then 6 or 7 weeks later, somebody runs into this order and figures out that, oh, oops, that was not supposed to be 126 million. And they fix that. And then that makes our bookings drop by $100 million, which again hits the reports, and the salesmen go crying to their mommy because they lost $100 million. And this happens often, all the time, nonstop, because we are entering, you know, hundreds and hundreds of orders every day. So, you know, we had to find a solution. So we've talked to the users quite a bit and said, you know, you need to double check your orders. This is important for reporting purposes. Revenue estimates and projections are generated off of our bookings tables. If you make a huge mistake, it's going to affect the projected revenues and the projected commissions for our sales force, who are basically our lifeline in our company. And the same thing happens in purchase orders. If you enter a purchase order that's huge, again, that affects commissions on the negative side, because they basically means that the sales rep is buying a whole bunch of things that then he's going to turn around and sell. And again, if you enter a $2 million purchase order, that affects the projections on all our reporting. So we talk to the users and we are blue in the face, and it doesn't make a difference. They continue to make huge mistakes like this, where there's millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of dollars orders in the system. So we had to find a solution. So we said that the solution was to fire them all, but apparently it's hard to find employees. So we had to come up with a better solution. And so we decided to try and put some bumpers into place. But we immediately run into a situation, right? What kind of a bumper are we going to put into place? Is it stop them from entering an order that's too large? Great, let's find out what that means. And so I go have a conversation with 10 of our different customer account reps, and they all have different numbers for what an order means to be too large. Well, let's stop them from entering $100,000 worth of orders. Well, we have a couple of customers who order $250,000 at a time. Okay, then bump it to $250,000. Well, 90% of our customers will never order that big of an order, and so on and so forth. And that conversation kind of goes around in circles forever until you end up like the poor guy on the picture. So the solution was outlier analysis. So what we decided to do was, we cannot hard code a limit on the orders or the POs to a specific number because our orders vary, our customers vary. We have 41 plants throughout the United States, all of which sell different industries, different amounts. So putting any number in place that would, stop or cause an auction from the user would cause a lot of heartache. So what we ended up deciding to do was outlier analysis. So for those that don't know what that is, outlier analysis is basically the process in identifying something that is outside the standard, right? And I say standard with quotes because there's a couple of ways to define what the standard is, right? One of them is using a standard deviation formula. I'm sure you have all memorized it. There will be a quiz at the end. And basically the standard deviation determines how far away one order is from the other. So if you have two orders, the standard deviation between them is the distance between those two orders, and then you apply that across an entire data set. And so the formula is beautiful like that, as you can see. And you usually can identify an outlier by multiplying that standard deviation times 2.5. And so if a new order coming in is 2.5 times greater distance from the standard deviation than the standard orders in the system, that's considered an outlier. So that was one option that we could choose. And so we did some research around that and kind of didn't love the fact that standard deviation can be easily manipulated by outliers themselves. So if you do get an order through the system that is $1 million, your standard deviation is going to shift quite drastically. And so then the next time you enter a $900,000 order, it may not catch it. So we didn't love that solution. Also, it required that formula that I have in the screen there. And frankly, I'm not a huge fan of Greek math. So then we said, okay, well, what other option is there? And so we ran across what's called an IQR, or Interquartile Range outlier analysis. And this one we liked quite a bit. And basically what it does is it looks at the middle 50% of your orders. So if you have 100 orders in the system, it looks at order 25 all the way through order 75. And it considers that to be what's called your interquartile range. So if you look at this picture down here at the bottom, again, if you have 100 orders sorted by value in this case, because we're trying to look at the value of the line, your highest value orders are going to be here on the top 25%, and your lower value orders are going to be on the left on the bottom 25%. But the interquartile range is this little sweet spot in the middle here where basically about 50% of your orders lie. And so the way you calculate an outlier there is you basically take your interquartile range, so that which is basically the Q1 minus Q3, so that's the range, and then you added or subtracted from the bottom and the top. And so basically your most expensive order and your least expensive order plus or minus the interquartile range times 1.5 gives you the outlier. And again, that's a bunch of math that doesn't really matter, but in the end, what you end up with a range like this, where basically your median order, or the average, the middle of your orders falls right in the middle. Then you have your interquartile range, which basically is your 50% of your orders fall between these two. And then you end up with these whiskers here. And those whiskers are kind of like the wiggle room that you are allowing, in this case, that we're allowing our sales reps and our account reps to have. So we basically say, hey, most of our orders fall in that orange box. So if you're in that orange box, everything is good. But we also, we don't want to limit them to exactly orange box. So we want to say, you can also go all the way through to the end of the whiskers at either end, and we're going to consider that a good order, or an order that doesn't require further action. But anything that falls outside those two ranges, we need somebody to look at and make sure that you're not crazy. So we identified the problem, we identified a solution, and then the biggest question was, how the heck do we implement this in Epicor? So we did some research, and we actually found out that SQL, straight up SQL, can help you calculate natively without any special magic, can help you calculate that interquartile range. So there's this function in SQL called percentile_CONT. And when you apply it to a query, you can basically say, hey, SQL, give me the bottom 25 or the top 25 or the top 75% of this particular query data set. And so we found that out, and we threw it into SQL. And so let me bring that up real quick, because we wanted to see, hey, I mean, technically or allegedly, you can do this in SQL, but is that accurate? Is that true? Does it work? And so we basically started out by doing a simple select query where we just get the company, part number, and customer number. Again, we wanted to make sure that it was by customer because, like I said before, some of our customers order really large orders, and some of our customers order smaller orders. So we didn't want to limit it to just a part number or even an order value in general. We wanted it to be very specific to that part and that customer that we're entering so that we can get a more accurate representation. So the first thing we did is we just got basically a simple list of all our orders by part and customer and calculated the line value by basically multiplying the quantity times the unit price. So that's a straight up simple query, not a big deal there. And so to use the quartile range, the quartile function rather, we needed to get this information here. And then we had to apply that across those percentile functions. So we used a CTE, which a lot of you may or may not be familiar with, but a CTE is a common table expression, and that's actually built into Epicor. So in Epicor, when you're making a BAQ, you can select the BAQ type to be a CTE. And all that does is it appends this with clause and it gives it a name and it puts it at the very, very top of your SQL statement. What that does basically is it actually calculates this statement first and then creates a temporary table in memory that you can then select from. So for example, I have just created a CTE here with the original query that we had in place. And so now I can simply select star from value by part by cost, right? And I can run that. And that gives me the exact same data that we got before. But now it's basically calculating all of this first and then executing this statement, which means that now I can use these numbers that are already calculated further in the rest of my queries. So what we ended up doing then is using that facility, that CTE, to calculate the different quartile ranges for each part number and customer number. And we did it again using that percentage cont function. And that's built into SQL, so there's nothing magical we had to do there. So basically the way it works is we said, all right, give me the company, the part number, and the customer number from the original query. And then we said, all right, and also give me the Q1 or the first quartile, the third quartile, the median, that is the 50th percentile, the middle order. And then I said, hey, and also give me that IQR or the interquartile range, and that is Q3 minus Q1. So when we run this now, you can see that we get a part number and a customer number, and then we also get the 4 values here that we expect. So most of these are going to be useless because it doesn't. Not all the orders are going to have a nice range. But for example, this one here, we can see that for this customer and this part number, our quartile starts at 5,100 and it ends at 7,650. Our median is also at 5,100, and the IQR, or the interquartile range, falls to 2,550. So what that means, though, is that if I want to enter an order in my system for this part number and this customer, I can enter an order anywhere in this range times 1.5 of that, so that it can fall within that range. So with a little bit more SQL magic, and again, not complex, it literally is just a bunch of select statements, I can actually now get my outlier minimum and my outlier maximum in a single SQL statement. And I know I'm doing all these in SQL, but what I'm trying to show you is how we built it and how we got where we are. So now I have my part number, my customer number, my quartiles, my median, my interquartile range, and then I have my min and max outliers. So now if I enter for this customer and this part, I enter an order, as long as it falls between these two ranges, we're going to consider that an okay order, meaning that's an order that's typical or average. If it falls outside of that range on either direction, we're going to consider that an outlier. So we did this in SQL. We were very excited that it worked, and we said, well, how in the world are we going to recreate this in a BAQ? But looking at it with a little, with some detail, we realized this is nothing fancy. It's really just one CTE, another CTE, and a select statement. And this can be done straight in Epicor. So we did. So we just literally went into BAQ entry. Oh, hold on, I have a pop-up somewhere I'm trying to get rid of. There we go. We went straight to BAQ entry. And we did exactly that. And I will make this BAQ available for everybody after this. I'll post it on Epi Users or send it to Calvin and Fred. But basically, we started the same way. A simple order detail. In this case, I give it some parameters because I want to be able to search for one specific one at a time. But let's ignore that for now. Order detail, and I got those 3 fields as well as my calculated value. And then I made the type as CTE. And again, what that does is exactly what it did before. It puts it at the very top with a with statement. And so then we did another CTE below that to calculate what we call our quartiles. And again, that was the exact same thing we did here, right? So those quartiles, we used a simple calculated field. Again, Epicor lets you do almost anything inside of a calculated field, as long as it doesn't consider it a SQL injection. So you can put a select statement in here, but what you can do is do calculated fields. So we literally do the exact same thing for percentile count 25, group by, order, partition by, so on and so forth. This is it's called a windowing function for those of you who are SQL heads. And so we just went ahead and created those quartiles, quartile 1, quartile 3, the interquartile range, which is Q3 minus Q1, as well as the interquartile outlier, so is that IQR times 1.5, as well as the median and then the minimum maximum. So now we have a BAQ that I can simply run, and when I run it, it asks me for a few things. It asks me for the part number, the customer number, the line value, that is the total value of the line. It asks me for the line cost because we're also doing some margin analysis, but that's a little unrelated to this. And it also asks me for the order and line number if I want to provide it. And when I run that, I get back the information I'm looking for, right? So I get back the interquartile range. You can see here. I get back a checkbox that says whether this is an outlier or not. I get back my margin, which is, again, a little unrelated to this. But we also get that outlier minimum and outlier maximum. So in this case, the outlier minimum is -158, and the outlier maximum is 1100. And again, what it's telling me is that the order can be between this range. Now, when the outlier minimum is negative, that's kind of silly. We're never going to sell anything on the negative. But again, that's because we have some orders out there that are so small. Maybe this part was, they bought one part at a time or something like that, that when we multiplied that Q1 times 1.5 and subtracted it from the minimum order, we ended up on the negative. But that's okay, because what that means is that we can have, for this part, we can have an order anywhere from $0 to $1,100, and that's considered standard. So now we have a BAQ in the system. Now we can do various things with this. We could put them in a dashboard and have somebody review them daily and see if any orders fell in between that range. We could do a pop-up alert. We could do a bunch of those things. So what we chose to do is use a Bpm Data Form to place the alert in line, because the biggest issue we have is that people come after the fact later on and notice the errors, but they do not notice the errors as soon as they happen. And what we wanted to do was prevent the error from occurring to begin with. So now, if I'm an account rep and I'm making an order here, I can go make a new line, and I can select a part number in our system. All right, and I say I'm going to order 1,000 of these. All right, and now that looks pretty good. And I'm going to hit save. And what's going to happen is the system is going to run that BAQ via a BPM. And in that BPM, the system is going to calculate that interquartile range by running this BAQ. It's going to determine if the order is an outlier, and if it is, it's going to alert the user. So a pop-up like this is going to come out, and it's going to let the user know exactly what the problem is. So you can see here what the problem is right away, because it's A, a graphical representation, and B, it gives them exactly what the problem is, right? So what it's saying is, hey, the outlier analysis for this order shows that, hey, our order typically falls in this range, right? But your order is way out here. You have a $2,400 order. That's very atypical for this customer. Our customer in this particular part, we fall in this range right here. And so what that allows us to do is allow the user to notice the error, see what the problem is, and make changes if they choose to. And again, that was all done with straight SQL, and then turn it into a BAQ, and then just running that BAQ with a simple Bpm Data Form. This graph up here, it's a little fancier, but basically all that is a web app called Zing Chart, where you can give it a few parameters, and it displays this beautiful little rendering for you. This was more than anything icing on the cake. You could do this entire thing without the graph. You could simply display the information, which is what we did at the bottom here, to get the information. Again, the graph was just because we were trying to be fancy. But yeah, that's basically the solution that we came up with. And so it allows them freedom to enter their orders without getting constantly bombarded with messages and pop-ups. It allows them to proceed with most typical orders. Again, 50% of our orders fall in this blue box. So we're giving them a lot more than 50% of our orders in range. So 75 to 85% of the orders they enter for this customer and part, they will get no pop-up. It'll work just fine. And then for those that fall outside the range, they're going to get a message that's very clear that tells them exactly what the problem is. And they can always choose to continue, right? But that's a choice that they're making after they have been informed of the mistake. And we're doing the same exact thing for PO analysis, purchase order analysis. So any questions about that so far? I can delve a little more into the technical aspects of it, and I will. I just wanted to know if you have any questions at this point as to how it works and what the purpose of it is.
We'll hang for a couple seconds just in case people are typing questions in, but so far nobody's posted anything yet.
Okay. I'll take a sip of water. All right. So let me jump over here. So how we executed this was a simple BPM, pre-processing BPM on master update. And so I can show you this. Now, I don't know if I'll make the BPM itself available just because it's a little specific to us, but I'll definitely make the BAQ available to you after this if you're interested. And then again, the BPM is fairly straightforward, right? So I'm checking to make sure that this is either a changed order or an adder or a new row. And then I'm checking to make sure that the price of that line changed, because I don't want to bombard it every time they save, right? So when they save the order for the very first time, I'm going to check. And if that's okay, no pop-up happens. Otherwise, when they make a change to that total price, and that happens by either changing the unit quantity or the price, then they're going to get a pop-up. Where will the BAQ and BPM be posted? I'll be posting it on Epi users. I'll send them to Calvin and Fred too, but I'll post it on Epi users so you can get access to it. Anyway, so if that's the case, so if there is a change to the price and or there's a new order that we're going to go ahead and run that query. So what we did here is we run the BAQ in our BPM. You can do this with widgets if you want to. It's not that hard. I just prefer to do code because it's a little bit more, gives me a little bit more control. So again, that BAQ is called margin and cost checker. And I'm just passing in those parameters in code: part number, cost number, line value, line cost, and order line. So I'm passing that and I'm executing the BAQ by ID. So when that BAQ executes, I get back the same row that you guys already saw here. So let me bring that up again. We get back this information here. And I'm looking for this outlier checkbox being true, or I'm looking for the low margin checkbox being true. Either of those true, I'm going to go ahead and pop up that message. So again, if we go back to the BPM, and we wait for that to open, there we go. If the outlier is true or the low margin is true, I'm going to set a few of my BPM call context fields. And the reason I'm doing this is because, as much as the BPM is nice, and frankly, all you need to do here at this point, if you don't want to be fancy, is you can say info message that show your order is out of range, right? And that's it, you're done. But I wanted to give them a little bit more information. So what I decided to do is I decided to present that information to them via a Bpm data form. And so that's why I'm populating my my Bpm data fields with the information I got back from that BAQ. So I'm populating that information in the Bpm data field so that then I can go and call my Bpm data form, and that's going to receive the call context values that I just populated. And with those call context values, then I can display that pop-up that I showed you. So again, if we look at how that Bpm data form is, I can just, it's fairly straightforward. It's going to give me an error because I didn't pass any information here, but it just, it's a straight up, and these are just, these fields here are just bound to those call context fields so that I can display it. And again, the thing in the middle here, which again is a little bit more fancy, and again, I don't necessarily want to go into details on the zinc chart thing, although it is a very nice tool. It's a little more advanced than I think most of you are going to want to deal with.
I sent a link out to everybody for the download and the info for zinc chart.
Perfect. But basically what I'm doing is I'm using the web browser view. So there's a web browser view is built into Epicor. Is actually the way that Epicor themselves displays all the Kinetic forms. So when you're in Epicor Kinetic 2020 something X and you see a Kinetic form, that's actually a browser that's embedded. It's a browser that's embedded in Epicor. So all I'm doing is I'm using that same browser, and it's called the EO browser, or I think it's called Extension Explorer. I forgot what the Essential Objects browser. That's what it is. It's called the Essential Objects browser. You can Google that up. Essential Objects is a C# library that is available within Epicor, and you can simply put it in your forms. And if I look for that web browser view, there's a right here. I can just set the URL to the web page that I want to display, in this case as an internal page for us, and then I'm passing in some parameters to that zinc chart, the minimum, the Q1, the Q2, and so on and so forth. And that's what makes it pop up that chart and look so pretty. But the rest of this is really just that BAQ being executed and displaying those values so that I can put them in the chart. So the great majority of the code in here has to do with that chart and getting it the way that I want it to look. And then I added a couple of row rules here to highlight the fields for low margin and outlier. So if you ignore the chart part, which is again more fancy than it really needs to be, this can be done without any custom code on the Bpm data form. All you need to do is populate those call context fields, and then the information will display in that pop-up the same way. So if you ignore that, if you ignore the top portion here, then all this stuff at the bottom here doesn't have any custom code. It's simply the result of the BAQ being passed into the call context Bpm data form. And then, I have two buttons here, one that says make changes or continue. Again, those buttons, don't require any custom code. The buttons are actually set up in the Bpm form here. You can make changes. It's got a value of 1111, and continue has a value of 1112. And what happens is when you click those buttons in the Bpm data form, there's a field in the call context called button value, and that button value will take on whatever value of the button you clicked. So if you click the first button, it's going to get 1111. If you click the second button, it's going to get 1112. So then really no code again. All you have to do is check that button value. And if it's not equals to 1112, which in my case is continue, then I'm going to simply raise an exception. And that's going to stop the update. And that exception is going to simply say, make the required changes and save the line again. So that basically what happens is when they save this and they get this pop-up, if they click make changes, I just raise that exception here to let them, because you have no choice. I want to stop that update from happening. So I raise an exception that just says make the required changes and save the line again. So then they can say, okay, well, it turns out the price on this is wrong, and it's really supposed to be I don't know, $1.2012, whatever it is, right? And then they can hit save. And if that falls outside the range, then they won't get a pop-up anymore. In this case, I think we're at the very edge. Yeah, I happen to pick a value that's literally a couple of bucks outside the range because I'm lucky like that. But again, if you can see here, yeah, that's very close. So this may be one of them that they say, no, that's actually correct. And I'm okay with that. And I hit continue and finish. And what that's going to do, though, is it's going to add this order because this is calculated on the fly every single time they run an order. This order, once I hit continue here and save, this order is now going to be part of my interquartile range calculator. And this is going to be an order on the far end of the spectrum. It's going to be at the very end. It's going to be one past the max. And what's going to happen is the next time they run this, that interquartile range is going to be bumped ever so slightly in one direction or another and allow you to have a little bit more wiggle room. But the nice thing about it is that it really, the IQR focuses on the 50% orders in the middle. So if you have some really crazy outlier orders that you let go through, that's not going to affect your IQR right away, like it would with something like a standard deviation. So anyway, so that's really the solution that we came up with and how we solved the problem. Most of it required no code. It was a simple somewhat simple BAQ, and again, a BPM to display the results. You can even run that BAQ without code. I just chose to do it in code because it was a little easier for me to do it that way. But really, this solution as a whole can be done without code, and it is compatible or reusable across the board with something like the Kinetic UI. The Kinetic UI also supports Bpm Data Forms. Now, you probably can't easily embed that nice little graph on there, but you can still have the Bpm Data Form pop up, display the message, show that there's a problem with your order, and you don't really have to write any code. That's, I'm trying to keep, and I have been since the last couple of years since Kinetic came out, is move all my customizations to be server side, right? BPMs, great. BAQs, fantastic. Epicor functions, even better, right? Move all your code to the server side, and that's going to make your upgrade experience to Kinetic a lot cleaner and a lot easier to handle. So in this case, I'm not going to have to change much when we decide to go to Kinetic on order entry. If I want to still display that graph, I could do an App Studio customization to display the graph when the pop-up comes up. But in general, it would work out of the box as is without having to change anything of the solution.
Actually, Jose, your graph accepts a JSON data packet from ZingChart,
yep.
so it should run without any issue in Kinetic, and there is a web tool, a web browser tool that you can embed on Kinetic Forms and then pass the URL with the JSON data. So that should convert without a problem.
Yep, exactly. So embedding that browser into Kinetic, there's an iframe widget, so you can embed other web browsers into Kinetic, like Calvin said. You do have to do a little, App Studio customization to make that happen. It's not going to happen automatically with your upgrade. So that's what I was referring to. If you want to display the chart, you are going to have to do an App Studio customization, fairly minor one, to that Bpm data form in App Studio. But again, it will require no code. You basically give it the URL of your ZingChart, give it the parameters passed in from your Bpm calc context, and you're off to the races. So again, move all your customizations to the server side. There are very, very few things that I have found that you cannot do server side. So when you're trying to design a solution, whether it's this one or another, think about how can I do this outside the client, and then send a message back to the client to let them know that something happened. That's going to make your life much easier. And it's going to make your code reusable in other places. So one of the things that I need to do, this solution is a little older, but one of the things that I'm going to do is move this to a function, an Epicor function, instead of it being a combination of BPM and BAQ. It'll probably just be a function that does the BAQ, and then I can call that function from anywhere in the system without any problems. Okay, well, I think that's it from the presentation aspect. If anybody has any questions, though, I'm more than willing to go into more detail about how this solution works.
Okay, the first question, will Bpm Forms appear identical from Winforms versus Kinetic Interface? And this is from Monty Wilson.
They will not appear identical. So Bpm Forms on Kinetic Interface are going to be on a slide out panel. So no, they will not appear identically. It's going to be basically an automatic form that pops up when you do it. So it's going to look a lot more like the base. So if I do, let me open this up here. if I do the non-customized version of my BPM form, it's going to look like this. So this is the base version of my form without any fields on it or anything like that. You could add fields. I just didn't need any at this point. But if I were to run this form in Kinetic, this is what it would look like. But instead of it being a pop-up, it's going to be a slide out panel from the right. But it will look identical to this. It will have a message and we'll have the 2 buttons. If you want additional fields, though, you can go into your field maintenance here and add fields. So if I were to do a new field here and say bind it to one of those fields I'm populating, whatever it is, and again you run it, it will look identical to the base method. So in this case, it will look like this. Again, in Kinetic UI, it would be a slide out panel, but it will look exactly like this with the field, the text, and the 2 buttons. So there is a one-to-one correlation there between the 2. But your customizations obviously are not going to look identical because you're going to have to redo those in App Studio.
Okay, another question from Matthew Hack. What was the impact of this customization on the root issue?
I mean, it solved the issue for the most part. You still have people who just hit continue, but at this point they can't say they didn't see it. So there's more accountability now, right? You're unfortunately, coming from as an IT guy, as a person who's been working with users a lot, you're never going to be able to force users to do something unless you literally put them in a box and make them do it. We didn't want to stop them from entering outliers because we do have cases where a customer calls us out of the blue and they're like, hey, I need this right now and I need 10 million of it, no questions asked. Well, we don't want to put a hindrance on that, right? Business is business and money is money. And if you want to give us $1 million for 10 trinkets, have at it. But we do want the user to be aware. So it is more an awareness thing, giving the user the option to double check their work and then hit continue on that. And if we start seeing problems, and we have seen a huge reduction on those mistakes, but when we do see a problem, we can approach the user directly and say, hey, we know that you got a message about this. Clearly, this is a problem. Why did you make that mistake, and what can we do to correct it in the future? So it's more of accountability than it is something that automatically will fix the problem. Although, again, when the users get hit in the face with that big pop-up, they 99% of the time will say, oh, oops, I didn't mean to do that, and they'll go back and fix it.
And then also for Monty, we have what will happen the first time a customer orders a specific part.
So I put a couple of things in the BAQ to account for that. So if we look at the, BAQ, I basically said that if the interquartile range is 0 or the interquartile range is, I'm looking for my code here. Where is it? One of these calculated fields, I think, is top level. So basically, I said if the interquartile range is too low or too high, then do something a little more smart. I think I multiplied it. Yeah. So basically, I said, when the interquartile range is 0, meaning that there's no other orders in the system, I just said take the bottom quartile and multiply it times 0.1. So that gives you a little wiggle room. It's a little smaller room than normal. That was just a choice. Otherwise, Monty, what would happen by default is you would get that pop-up right away every single time. So we wanted to give them the ability to do a little bit outside the range, particularly when they only have one order in the system. When they only have one order in the system, anything outside that order is going to be an outlier. So we wanted to give them, maybe a 10% difference up and down on that first order or two. And then if they have no order in the system ever, they'll get that pop-up, and they'll say okay and move on with their lives.
Wonderful. Any other questions from the group? Looks like a very cool way to solve the issues there, Jose.
Yeah, and we thought it was pretty cool, and the nice, it was nice that it was pretty much standard Epicor. There wasn't any hacky stuff that we had to do. It was a simple, just a BAQ and a couple of BPMs. And again, it can be applied across the board. So we are working on the same solution for POs and anywhere else in the system where we feel like there should be some kind of, hey, double check this, don't make a mistake. so that we can catch the problems before they happen. Because once the problem happens, then it becomes an issue. We have same problem happens in jobs. You have jobs that end up with a huge manufacturing variance sometimes because somebody made a mistake. They over received or under received or over reported something, and then you end up with these huge manufacturing variances. Again, that's a good place where you can look at and say, you know, this job on average has taken you X number of hours to complete for this part and that quantity. Why did it take you 16 times longer this time, right? That shouldn't happen. So when we go close the job, same place you can put something like this to look at your overall job cost and say, you know, the cost on this job is through the roof. Did something happen? And it just gives them the ability to stop and pause and think, oh, oops, I know what happened there. I made a mistake. I over-reported. We actually had there's a bug in Epicor that if you report quantity and end activity exactly at midnight, and you have been clocked in since the day before, sometimes Epicor will get you over 24 hours of labor. And so again, when that happens, you'll see that huge cost uptick, and that'll be a place where you can stop and do a quick job adjustment to fix that problem.
And from Matthew Heck, how do you get the comment at the top of the BAQ SQL text?
You purchase the BAQ designer from Epicor. That's their disclaimer.
You want this? That happens by default, right? So that's just Epicor letting you know that what you see here is not what the code executes, because BAQs, standard BAQs, have a whole bunch of security layers on top of it. So every time that you bring in the customer table, or the plant table or the territory table, Epicor takes this and applies a boatload, and I do mean a boatload of security to it to make sure that you don't get access to the wrong territory information, to make sure that you don't get access to the wrong customer information and things like that. So the code you see here is generally what the BAQ will run like, but because of security implications and company permissions and things like that, Epicor will append a whole bunch of extra SQL at the bottom that you do not get to see. So they're just letting you know that, hey, if you copy paste this into SQL and run it, the results will not be exactly the same unless you happen to have the very right permissions at the right time and all that stuff. So it's just a disclaimer that Epicor puts up there. There's nothing you can do to change that.
Yeah, this is not a cloud thing. This is just Epicor.
And an esoteric question for you, Jose. Why'd you go with CTEs instead of subqueries?
Because I needed to be able to take the calculated value from up here and use it in the windowing function. I tried to do it with subquery, and I kept running into syntax errors and weird quirky things. So I threw CTE out there to see if that would get around it, and that seemed to work. So I think it's something specific to this percentile continuation and the windowing function that caused me to have to use a CTE. There may be ways to get it to work on a subquery, but the CTE just kind of flowed nicely. And it also gives you that the ability to roll up everything first before you do the work. So performance can be a little bit better depending on how the CTE is set up. But again, you could probably tweak this into using inner subqueries. There isn't really a huge difference between them, unless you're doing something like recursion, which in this case, we're not doing recursion, so we don't need to worry about that.
And I've found typically I was going to say, typically I've found CTEs are going to work a little bit faster if you're reusing them as opposed to using subqueries, just because the subqueries get executed the number of times you've got the subquery, whereas the CTE will only get executed once and then stored as a temp table.
Yeah, exactly. So like Fred said, so CTEs, remember I talked about how CTEs work, right? They make a little table in memory, and then that table is used anywhere. So if I were to take that CTE here and drop it into 16 different subqueries, Epicor will not rerun, or rather SQL will not rerun that CTE over and over again for each subquery. Rather, they'll calculate the CTE once, use that as an in-memory table to then do joins to everything else. While if you use an inner subquery, it will literally copy that select statement down to each of the pieces of your query, and it will rerun that query over and over again for each of the subqueries. So if you have a really complex subquery, the CTEs can actually, and you're going to be reusing that, the CTEs can actually help quite a bit. And again, you know, most people, depending on how advanced you are with BAQs, you may not have that complex of a subquery, but You can definitely make some doozies out there with BAQs. BAQs are extremely powerful, and it's actually a good way to bring your server down to its knees if you write a bad BAQ. So keeping performance in mind is always a good thing.
And I try to tell people don't go crazy with the subqueries either, because I have built a number of subqueries that just started blowing up. So
yeah, I was gonna say,
it was like around
I just brought this
10 or
unrelated
12,
one here.
it starts getting really wacky. Yeah.
It does, exactly. So I just brought this one up here. This is a pretty complex BAQ that I was working on yesterday, and it has a boatload of subqueries in here and unions and all sorts of things. So again, anything you can do to improve performance and reduce server load is a good idea. For example, this last sold CTE, what that does is it gets me the last time a part was sold in the system, and I reuse that on almost every one of these unions here. So again, by putting it as a CTE, it means that the last time a part was sold is calculated one time, and then that value is simply joined one-to-one to every one of these unions that I'm using it down here. So again, it's an architectural consideration more than it is a need, but it will sometimes improve your performance.
All right, and another question for Monty. How do you access the BAQ from the BPM code or BPM widgets? I think you may have just missed that when you were showing that there.
Yeah, like I said, I'll post, when I post it to the Epi users, I'll post an example on how to execute a BAQ in code. There's a bunch of examples already out there in Epi users and the EUG forms, but I'll post another example on how to execute this specific BAQ in a BPM. So I'll post that on Epi users, and I'll send the information to Calvin and Fred so they can relay it to you guys.
Wonderful.
But it's pretty simple. You just execute by ID and pass in the parameters. So again, this BAQ specifically has some parameters. So you're mimicking what Epicor does. So you can do a trace and look at it, but it's basically you fill in the parameters and you hit execute by ID.
Any other questions? We've still got a few minutes left of Jose's time.
For anybody on the meeting that is not familiar, Jose, can you go ahead and show Epi users and how to create an account for anybody that might be on the meeting that's not already part of that?
Sure. So again, Epi users is an independent forum that some of us run. It used to be the Yahoo groups. A lot of you were familiar with that, but it's epiusers.help is the URL. It's obviously completely open and completely free. And anybody can join. The only thing that we do require is a valid corporate email address, and the reason for that is we want to make sure that you're not misrepresenting a company or somebody else. So again, when you go to Epi users, you can just sign up. I believe, you can sign up with a bunch of other things, Facebook and Google if you really want to. But again, the most important part, and actually a bunch of people miss this, is if you're not using your corporate email address, there's a field down here that says corporate email address. Fill that in with your valid corporate email address. We promise we don't spam you. We don't send emails to it. We just verify that you are who you say you are and that you work for the company you say you're working for, because we do not want people to come in here and misrepresent other companies. So Epicor in the Yahoo groups used to secretly run the Yahoo groups, and they would ask you for your site ID to verify that you are you. Obviously, we don't have access to verify anybody's site ID, so our best solution to that is to ask you for your corporate email address so that we can say, hey, are you who you say you are? And as long as that's okay, then we approve you and let you in the forum. And there's a ton of people out there all the time working together. We have a get together at Nashville, a little dinner that we're doing together. So if you are going to be in Nashville on Insights, we'd love to see you there. There's information about that also on the forum, and I will be posting this BAQ and the example on how to call a BPM in the forum later on today. All right, and I think that's my time.
A couple more questions here. David, how you doing? You're drinking two different drinks. What are they? One has vodka, one has coffee.
That's right. One is vermouth. No, this is coffee and this is water. And I pick whichever one's closest, I guess. I didn't realize I was switching between them.
And Yusuf is asking, how'd you bring the upper and lower order line values on the form? That was in the code as well as a return data from the BAQ.
Yep, as return data from the BAQ. So as part of the BAQ, we return the lower and the max so that they know why. Again, if they don't see the display graph, they will at least know why the problem was. Is because we have a max and a min, and they're outside of it.
And Pierre has a question here, but not related, but how to create an updatable external BAQ.
That's probably a topic for a different EUG meeting. It's a little complex, but the gist of it is that you have your regular external BAQ, and then you have to select updatable, and then you have to go write the code by hand in your updatable process by invoking the Epicor business objects. There is no automated way to do that. But it can be done. We do it quite often on our system because we have 7 different companies and 41 plants, and sometimes we have to update one plant from another without access for the user. So we have to do kind of like a cross-pollination thing. So we need to update a different plant or a different company from the wrong place. And so we do an update via the external BAQ process. And again, it's just as simple as instantiating the Epicor business object, doing your get by ID, updating your fields, and calling the update method. It's not complicated, but you have to do it by hand. There's no automated checkbox or selector for it.
Okay.
Jose, I have a question. Would you say that unless you have a really complicated BAQ like you have with partitions and CTEs, when you're doing BPMs, try to stick to link queue as much as possible. Don't take this from Jose as, hey, just do everything in the BAQ and call BAQs. Like only when there's a special case. Don't go crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree, and thank you for bringing that up, Hazel. Yeah, in this case, I'm calling a BAQ from the BPM because doing that interquartile range calculation in link requires a PhD in biology. So I didn't want to deal with that. So I knew that SQL could handle it, so I did it in SQL directly. But yeah, 99.999% of your queries that happen on a BPM should happen using link. It's a lot faster, it's a lot cheaper, and it doesn't require you to invoke business objects and things like that, which is very heavy and expensive to do on a BPM. Again, remember, BPMs need to be light because they're injected in the process. And so if you do a BAQ that takes 30 seconds to run, and you put it in a BPM, guess what? That BPM is going to take 30 plus seconds now to execute, and your process is going to get halted. So yeah, don't do this unless you exactly have a problem you need to solve, like we did. But 99% of the time, write your queries directly in link, and don't invoke a BAQ for that.
And then Pierre said, hey, how to create an updatable external BAQ, maybe we can do that later. So if you want to throw that into Stump the Chump, I'll add that to that session.
There you go. Okay, I'll see if I can work up an example. I know I have one, so we can do it as Stump the Chump.
There you go, Pierre. I'll throw it into the Stump the Chump section.
And Yusuf also has a question. Don't you think link query makes the process slow?
No, a link query makes the process much faster than a BAQ would. Again, a link query is nothing but SQL, right? It literally turns into a straight up SQL statement. So it is the equivalent of you running SQL directly on the SQL box. It is as close to bare metal as you can get with Epicor. So no, link is much, much faster than BNQs. It does not have the extra layers of security. So territory security, company security, all those things are not in the link queries. So it's like you're going directly to the bare metal with only a little layer there between C# and SQL. And the translation engine for that has been extremely enhanced by Microsoft because they want to make sure that you can basically write native C# to run SQL. They have code first layers now. They have a bunch of really expensive libraries to handle link to SQL conversion. So link is as close as you can get to a raw SQL query, and I highly recommend you go that route if you can. Again, BAQs are very powerful and they have their place, but not necessarily invoked via BPM.
And just a note on the external BAQs from Pierre, he was meaning a table not part of Epicor, so you don't have
That's fine.
business objects.
You don't. No, you can still have business objects. We can talk about it in Stump the Chump. But yeah, I know. I think I know what he's saying. So, so you're saying you want to update an external table?
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, that's definitely doable too, but that requires SQL command stuff. That's a little more fancy than we probably want to get into. but it's definitely an option too. You'll have to basically establish a connection string to your database peer in C# and execute SQL commands directly in the database.
And I don't think we got to Gerardo's question. What's your take on external BAQs versus BAQs?
They have their place. Again, we use them extensively to bypass security, but that means that then you have to take responsibility for your own security. So it really all depends on what the end goal is and what your skill set is and how much are you willing to risk, right? We have a need to allow people access to areas that they do not have native Epicor access to. So we do that via external BAQs, and we put a huge amount of work into securing those BAQs so that people cannot go outside and color outside their lines. So external BAQs are very, very useful, particularly if you're going to go to an outside data source, right? If you're trying to, say, compare Epicor data to Salesforce data, those are great. They're great for that. But even for Epicor data themselves, I use them all. We use them all the time. We actually have a replication database set up that copies our transactions, live transaction replication from a production instance into an Azure cloud SQL instance that we use as an external data source. So we have live data, live Epicor data, instantaneously available to us in our external BAQs, and we use them externally. But again, you take that security into your helm, and you take responsibility for it. So if you give a query to somebody they're not supposed to have access to, that's on you. Versus if you do it with Epicor and you have set up security correctly in Epicor with territory security, buyer security, and things like that, you are kind of putting that onus on the Epicor side and letting them handle that information.
Thanks a lot, Jose. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Awesome, thanks.
Have a good one.